Great, welcome back everyone. I'm going to do slightly better timekeeping than James because he's not famous for that. But so not much time. I know a lot of people have a lot to say. Entirely appropriately, the subject for our first session has already bled into the subject for our second session. I say appropriately because, as many people noted, whatever is happening in Iran is happening at least partly because everyone there is connected to each other and to an extent to the outside world, though not enough for many reporters who are trying to find out what exactly is going on in there. Anyway, we will start with the question that we set ourselves for this session, which was the world in Iran. What can the West do? Given that the West is not a football team, is not necessarily all pulling in the same direction, I would rather rephrase that with a bit of an ice bucket challenge. What could Western governments do if they turn out to be minded to prevent this being a historical moment that flies by without radical change in Iran? And what should the diaspora do, given that we know it is already minded to do its utmost to prevent this moment flying by without radical change in Iran? Forgive the long-windedness of that, but the ice bucket challenge is this. In 2 words, Belarus and Syria. I put it to you that we don't live in exactly the same age as the 1989 revolutions in Soviet Union and subsequently, the other way around, in Eastern Europe and subsequently in the Soviet Union. As Anne Applebaum has written very persuasively and depressingly, we live in the age of Putin when he can fly in the shock troops of counter-revolution. And if we took the Arab Spring as our model, we would have expected to see regimes fall in Minsk already, in Syria already, in Russia even already, and they haven't. Enough from me. I want to start with Matty Heaven. You've already spoken a little bit. You have a close personal involvement in this. Could you start by telling us what your husband is up to and why, because that will lead us, I think, into the discussion of the very particular question of whether or not to prescribe the Revolutionary Guards.
Thank you, Giles. Yes, my husband currently is in his 13th day of hunger strike, and he's currently outside of the Foreign Affairs Office, and he's requesting the government to prescribe IRGC. And the reason why he put himself in that situation, to begin with, I was very shocked when he told me, and I didn't agree with his action, but I do now fully support him. The reason he made that decision, because he's also a human rights advocate, human rights activist for the last 15 years, trying to highlight Iran's human rights violations inside of Iran and try to be a voice, and spoke in United Nations and European Parliament about the human rights violations that take place inside of Iran. He was a very close friend of Ruhollah Zam and worked with him for 3 years behind the scene. And he, as you know, Ruhollah Zam was a journalist who was executed about 2.5 or 3 years ago. So his reasoning is that Iran revolution inside of Iran does not limit only in Iran. What he's calling, and also I'm supporting this, and many Iranians outside of Iran, currently people in Iran are fighting for their freedom. That's what they're calling, that's why it's called woman life freedom. The situation has become so dire in Iran that girls and teenagers are out in the street and they are consequencing their life because they don't have a freedom. But the fight that they're doing is actually not just for themselves. They're actually fighting for our freedom here in Europe, in UK, and the rest of the world. I think this is the key message that we need to understand and analyze, not just take my word, but analyze with facts and evidence about what's been going on in the last 44 years with the Islamic Republic of Iran and their activities of IRGC. So the freedom that they're calling, and why I say that our freedom is under jeopardy, because we know the Iranian regime has kidnapped, assassinated, even outside of Iran. Currently, the IRGC leader openly states that we're in Third World War. As far as they're concerned, they're in war with us, okay? So they're already, because Iran is the 5th richest country in terms of oil and 2nd in gas, they're not short of money, although people are dying of starvation and poverty inside. Their activity is being grown in the last 44 years. Every year, 100,000 people get educated from these Islamic centers, and they got 60 universities. They called Al-Mustafa University, and they're radicalizing people with their fundamental ideology. So the level of not just their terror activity in the Middle East, destabilizing Middle East, by calling out that if they have any position, they will get rid of Israel if they could, by not just supporting Russia in the war. They've been working on radicalizing their ideology in the West. That to a point that we are here in London, that we had to have journalists leaving UK because MI5 stated that they can no longer protect freedom of speech in this country. I mean, the situation is so dire that sometimes I feel like, it's unbelievable to a state that how can a government or a regime is able to do what they do. So,
Matthew, sorry to interrupt. I'm just very conscious.
Yes.
What do you make of what I believe is the official British government's position on this, which is the IRGC is an arm of the state, and of course an argument to this effect was expressed in the previous session, and to prescribe it effectively cuts off your access to the belly of the beast. An analogy would be that we haven't prescribed the FSB, even though, or Russian security forces, even though they too have launched attacks on British soil on individuals.
I think what we need to distinguish between appeasement and diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And the difference between having a diplomatic relationship, because similar, we waited for Russia, but they invaded Ukraine. We all, there was so many warnings that existed, but it was ignored, okay? But at similar time, we're seeing so much warning that is coming to us, and it's the IRGC giving us enough evidence, and we're still having a conversation. It is like having... I put it this way, very simple terms, because of their terror activities that they do it in our soil here, would you agree having a psychopath or a rapist or a killer in your house when you got children? Would you do that? As what I see, that IRGC, where they're using diplomatic channels, because we have Asadullah Assadi, who is a prime example. He used diplomatic channels to come in to bring bombs in order to detonate it. Luckily it was discovered beforehand, but they're using that channel to be able to do their terror activities to a point that Iran International is a prime example. It is temporarily closed down, but they had, at the time when they were open, they had wires and different fences. My argument is that how far are we going to protect ourselves with different fencing and double or triple or security here, where we are the foundation of democracy and we're an example to the world. And what message should we give to the rest of the world when we see that IRGC are looming around in London, freely doing their activity, and as a result, instead of putting measures and sanctioning them and prescribing them, we're having to take freedom of speech, move journalists outside of Iran, outside of UK, so that they can practice it. And my husband, who's an independent journalist, he feels so passionate and strongly about that. If we don't do anything now tomorrow will be too late.
Okay. I'm sure we'll come back to this, not least because prescribing the IRGC is a concrete, specific thing that foreign governments can do in a situation when it's quite hard to alight on those things. Bronwyn Maddox, my old boss, great pleasure to have you here in your new capacity as Chief Executive of...
Director will do.
Director
Thank you.
of Chatham House. Give us your big picture take from the outside world, from the fortunate West, if you like, of what's going on in Iran and how that affects your judgment as to what the West could do.
I don't think we can do very much apart from the two big things that we're doing already. And one of them is the raft of sanctions we've already got on. And one is covering what is going on there and feeding it back to the people there. And we should go on doing both of those things. The effect of the first one is that our leverage then becomes less. Iran finds ways of getting around that, but it doesn't make it futile at all. I mean, what's going on there is just one of these horrendous spectacles, the incredible bravery of people and the fact that a regime that is prepared to kill lots of its own people, very young women among them, can do a great deal to keep the lid on what everyone here wants to be a revolution and is trying very hard to be a revolution. But it still can be hard to see how it gets there. It does matter that there aren't leaders of it, though if there were leaders, they could be taken out by the regime. There's both sides of it. You know, we all wish that there was more that we could do. I don't know that prescribing the Revolutionary Guard makes a whole lot of difference one way or another, but it's a symbol, and we need to work out where to put that symbol, among other things. Some of the most effective stuff we can do is probably not at the government level. It is at the level of supporting the diaspora to support people back there, because the Iranian diaspora is one of the strongest things that this movement has. A constant reflecting back to the incredibly brave people there that many Iranians outside the country and many people outside the country really, really care about the outcome of this. But you're talking about a really brutal regime entrenched for a long time, 2 generations essentially, whose whole machinery has been on its own survival, not just in Iran, but across the region. And it is, as we can see in lots of other places, one of them being Russia, really hard for us to sit here and wish away a regime like that. Iran, because of its own isolation, which this regime has created, it's hard for us to influence what's going on in there. I wish there were more. I don't say there's nothing. I think we're doing 2 big things already. We should keep doing those. I think the expressions of support, which this is one, but there are lots, they matter. But we should recognize that there are limits, and it is very hard to predict the course of these things.
Right. You mentioned the diaspora. We have, I think, at least 2 members of the diaspora, obviously many representatives here, 2 from other time zones who I'd like to come to in just a second. There was a great groan from this side of the room when Bronwyn said we can't do much. Do you want...
I got halfway through a sentence, so there was a groan. You just allow me the...
We've heard it all before. Listen,
Yeah.
you say what the West can do. Let me say what Britain can do, right? And let me just give you a glimpse of Iran's network in the UK that the government is allowed to set up. You've got 5 Islamic centres in this country. The heads of these Islamic centres are directly appointed by the Supreme Leader. They have affiliated charities, right? You have Islamic colleges. The network is just so vast. I don't know how you're going to untangle it. But let me just give you...
So what's the point you're making?
Why don't you close them down? Why don't you close down Khamenei's outlets in the UK? This is something that you can do.
And then what? How does that get rid of the regime? It simply shuts it out of the UK. What's the point you're
sorry,
making there?
What, by closing down their network, you're not doing anything against the regime. You're hampering their operation by closing down their network. Let me just give you an example. Let me speak. Let me speak.
No, you didn't. You barely let me speak, and you've already spoken in the first half.
No,
as well.
I haven't.
Yeah.
Not on this.
Right.
Not on this issue. I don't know how many of you read the Times expose that we had about the architect of the mandatory hijab and morality police. He lives in Iran. He's got a government position, but he's also a UK resident. He's got economic activities here. He's a director of Islamic Human Rights Commission. The Islamic Human Rights Commission has a charity called Islamic Human Rights Commission Trust. The legal wing of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, his affiliated charity, is the approved advisor to the UK government on immigration. They've had 200 people in this country advise the UK government to settle in this country. And they're not opponents of the regime. They are the regimes. If you're not worried about Iran, at least be worried about your own security.
Okay.
What are you doing allowing the Khamenei's networks to take roots in this country?
Thank you, sir. I'll stop you there. I mean, I think we have two valid points. It's clear that there are specific things that can be done in specific places, but there's also a live question as to how they will impact the regime in its isolation. On that note, and I see you've got the mic and we've had a hand up there. I want to try and come first to
Can I just also say
No,
that
no, I'm sorry.
He's not even sanctioned. The architect of mandatory hijab and morality police, who's a UK resident, he's not even under sanction. The sort of things they sanction is like Boucher prison, which has got no economic activity outside Iran.
Understood.
Complete waste of time.
Thank you. Can we go to Cameron Cansarinia in Washington? If not, anyway, that is a request that I have filed. It would also be great if we could go to Ali Essasi. Thank you. And there we are. Thank you so much for joining us. Are you joining us from DC or from Canada?
No, I'm joining you from Ottawa in Canada.
Great. Thank you very well. So you have experience of recommending as an MP with the Liberal Party of Canada fill us in, the sanctioning or the prescription of a particular member of the Iranian regime who you accuse of being a member of the IRGC. This was not, apart from anything, a concrete specific action that you proposed. What happened and how do you see that impacting the regime on a broader scale? And is it a pattern that you could broaden out?
Well, having had an opportunity to listen to everyone, I quite simply don't believe it's perfectly fine for us to turn a blind eye to what the regime does either in the UK, in Canada, or anywhere else in the world. The fact of the matter is, in my opinion, that any country that does not adhere to the most fundamental norms of human rights can certainly not be considered to be a regime that plays by the rules and norms of the world we currently live in. And yes, it is difficult to have to counter the Iranian regime, but we have seen atrocities all over the place. You were talking about some of the complications that you have experienced in the UK. Well, let me tell you, here in Canada, we do have an association of individuals who lost their relatives when 3 years ago, the Iranian regime shot down an airliner that was flying over the skies of Tehran. So this whole notion that, well, Iran is a terrible enfant terrible and there's nothing that we can do with it is, in my opinion, the wrong attitude to have. Because the more we look the other way and the more we throw our hands up and say there's nothing we can do, the more we are emboldening the regime. If we look at some of the atrocities that they've committed in Syria, if we look at what they are doing to Ukrainians by assisting the Russians, it becomes pretty obvious that this policy of appeasement has not really truly proven to be successful, and that going forward, we're going to see the regime actually doing more and more terrible things.
So, Ali, what is the broad strategy here for the diaspora specifically? And please address, if you will, the question of leadership. Nazanin grabbed me just before we started and said, if you want leaders, look in the prisons. Clearly, that doesn't necessarily apply to the diaspora, but over to you.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's very obvious that this uprising is far from over. The reality is that the country is going through a very, very bleak period. And for everyone to recognize that, you just have to look, first of all, at all the social indicators in the country, and also look at how the country is in shambles when it comes to political rights, when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to economic mismanagement, when it comes to being an irresponsible steward of the environment. I mean, there are so many challenges that Iranians are having to contend with within Iran, that for anyone to think that this is going to be over is, in my opinion, a high folly. And there's no doubt in my mind that these uprisings will continue. And I think it's incumbent upon the rest of us to actually stand on their side and to stand on the right side of history.
And how do you organize and how do you help on the leadership question?
Well, how do you help on the leadership question? As was alluded to by one of your guests, one of the things we have seen is there are certainly many, many leaders within Iran who are part of networks throughout the country. We have seen demonstrations in over 150 cities. So the more we see leaders within the diaspora connect with and talk to the leaders within Iran, the more you will see strategies coordinated between Iranians within and outside Iran.
Okay, thanks so much. If we can come to Cameron, we will. In a moment. But first, you have the microphone, and then we can come to both of you at the back. And if James was foolish enough, generous enough to, I forget, there were two other people who I think...
It was her.
Great, we'll come to you as well. But could you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Tahir Danish. I teach human rights law. So I want us to just step back for a moment and think about 1994, when the international community was asked to debate on whether what was unfolding in Rwanda could qualify as genocide or if it's mere crimes against humanity. We spent months debating that. Then April 1994 hit, and within April and July 1994, we had 800,000 people sliced to death. I feel, forgive me, I'm not a journalist, I'm just in human rights, but I feel as though the political will to address the issue of Iran is as weak as it was in 1994 when addressing Rwanda. Now, whether we prescribe or not, I don't feel is as important as realizing that Iran over the last century, if not longer, has acted as a catalyst in the region, if not the globe, to define international order, primarily the development of human rights instruments since the Genocide Convention. Iran was one of the first instances when we tested our Genocide Convention back in the 1950s, right? So I feel that we are again at one of those important moments in human history when Iran is redefining the meaning of revolution, because we are moving from a world that is fascinated with events and understanding the meaning of process. So our revolution is also becoming a process of transforming international order. That's where we're at. So if we have the political will to deal with it, we will. One other point that I want to make, and this is final, we've had sanctions against Iran. But what has happened? We've continued to deal with IRGC. We have continued to even get over the decisions, our international arbitration courts that have come down on Iran. And we have continued to send them money and go through Turkey and other banks, right? So if we are going to have further sanctions, if we are going to use our leverage, it has to be balanced with implementation of United Nations guiding principles on all the businesses in the West so that they cut the demand for the business that Iran brings to them.
And we can see how much success or otherwise there has been in enforcing sanctions during the acute emergency of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What do you make, by the way, of the comment at the end of the last session that what the people in Iran actually want the West to do is, what was it? Nothing?
Not supporting the regime.
Not to do what they are doing already.
And by that you meant not to support the regime?
Yes.
Oh, I see. Thank you for clarifying that. I guess you'd go along with that.
From the youth in Iran, because I'm obviously in touch with them on a regular basis,
Yeah.
is that actually there is no separation anymore between Iran and the West. You look at how Iranian youth live in Iran. They're far more connected with what is going on here in London than I may be. They tell me how to dress. They tell me what is going on in the world. They're way ahead of me. So I feel what is going on is actually goes back to what Professor Ahi was saying about the funds that he referred to. These funds that are set up for socioeconomic development of specific locations around the world. Whether the funds are there or not, we now live in an age of social media. Every single one of us has the power to socioeconomically develop Iran. That's been there for a number of years, and we now have foundations set right here in the United Kingdom that have been working on educating Iranians directly for a long time. And that's the way you bring about lasting change. So whether the funds are set up or not, all of us have the platform to make that happen today.
And just a simple technical point. Is it the case that young people's access to the outside world via social media now is unrestricted by comparison with in China, for example, where there's been a comprehensive attempt to firewall the internet?
I think the dynamics are different. You can't compare the two. For instance, in the case of China, they are very much for socioeconomic development and development socioeconomic rights, whereas Iran isn't necessarily. So these are different dynamics, which means the access that they have to the technical, details that they need to make that happen are very different. But from what I understand, whether they're using their, VPNs or anything else, VSNs, whatever, they're still in touch. They're getting things done. We actually have, I would say, more happening now with much more difficulty. You have to use different platforms, but it's there, and they're making it work, and they're determined to see this through. I just like to remind everyone that every year we go through revolutionary movements in Iran. This is right before Nowruz. People are busy with other things, and it's cold. You can't go out and say, I don't want hijab when you're freezing cold. You have this scarf around you. Give us till summer. We're going to see whether this is a revolution or not.
Really interesting point. Yes, two speakers on the other side of the table, then we'll come to you. And at the back. Yes, go ahead.
Two very brief points.
Can you introduce yourself for the room?
Sorry, I'm Charlotte Leslie. I'm the director of the Conservative Middle East Council. Two very brief points on the debate about prescription. It seems that we're stuck in a situation of choosing between a measure that recognises the atrocity of what an organisation is and the attitude we should have towards it, and taking the disbenefits of losing practical mechanisms by which we may tackle it. And I remember the debate going on with Hezbollah and exactly the same conversation being had. And it makes me think, do we need a different measure other than prescription, whereby you get the benefits of recognising what an organisation and its individuals are, but manage to keep the benefits as well of practical ways to continue to engage. Perhaps we've just got the mechanism wrong, it's too binary, and we need a mechanism that may get both the upsides.
Do you have an answer to that question? Is there a model you can point to?
There's not, but I wonder if I don't know how widely that question's being asked. Give it a proper noun and we can all debate it. Secondly, I wonder whether the question, what can the West do, is correct? Because the question I see people asking is, what should the West be? And we can't see these things in isolation. Why do the IGC feel empowered? Well, because the West has done a really good job at showing that it's a really soft touch, that its institutions, I'm afraid its politicians and everything else is pretty easily bought for very small amounts of money. It's particularly naive about the origins of that money. So even if we do sanction, if you look at cryptocurrency, and don't underestimate the ingenuity of money launderers who can clean up some pretty filthy money extremely quickly, what's the message we give? Well, if you do something really bad, we'll condemn it in the strongest possible terms. We're loud where we should be quiet. At the same time as we're the money laundering capital of the world here in London, we are also some of the most preachy and moral high ground countries there is, and that's not a good look for us. So we're loud where we should be perhaps a little bit quieter, but we're soft where we should be probably quite a lot harder and more precise and eyes wide open about who we're dealing with, where the money comes from. And there are surgical ways in which you can seriously hamper and stop the activities of people who should not be enjoying the benefits of a culture that they spend the rest of their time funding to destroy.
And a lot of that money is going to charities, or so-called affiliated charities.
Companies House and the Charity Commission would be two things the government could do to look at, and also the beneficial ownership rules need to be really, really nailed down. And all those vested interests and lobby groups who've managed to get the Treasury to give a little bit of slip room, we need to get around those, and we need some proper nailing down of that money laundering jelly.
I hear you. It's not just the BVI. Yes, Michael, and then back to this side of the table, and Dorian, I'm not forgetting. Yeah.
Michael Goldfarb, sometimes with the BBC, but mostly First Rough Draft of History podcast. The question is West, and I'm not sure what the West is, and I think that, the UK is part of it, and what the UK can do individually is one thing. But what I notice in the last 6 months in particular is this close alliance growing between the Iranian regime and the Russian regime, and at a time when allies allegedly of the West in the region, like Israel and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are maintaining very close contacts with the Russian regime. And I do wonder what Europe, which is what I think people mean by the West, Europe and America can do when the regime has chosen to ally itself with Putin. And what practically can be done at this moment of revolution internally, when externally the only play they could make was to ally themselves with an even more dictatorial and brutal regime than themselves. And I do wonder what Bronwyn thinks about what the bigger geopolitical questions are here, or answers. I pose the question to that.
Do you want to address that now?
Sure, I will. Thank you for that. And let me just say on the UK, I think this government, previous ones, have been naive and casual out of a kind of fantasy of the UK's financial strength about accepting all kinds of money in. They need to clean that up for the UK's sake above all. I still am unconvinced that it would on its own, beyond symbolically, have a huge effect on what we're talking about, which is how to destabilize the Iran regime. Michael's point, the geopolitical context of this matters an enormous amount. If you think what we've done, we pulled out of Afghanistan. We would wish the women there to have the rights we're wishing for the Iranians there. But what have we done? We pulled out after 20 years. It is no wonder that that encourages, for example, the Iranian regime. Probably the best thing we can do in the answer to this question, on top of the things that we're doing already, and I meant it, those are not nothing. I just said we couldn't do more than we're doing, which are sanctions and covering this. But the best thing we can do is keep pushing forward in Ukraine and supporting the Ukrainians, because if Russia and Putin were to win in some sense there, that enormously emboldens Iran. And the third thing on these, I would say, is to try to prevent Israel unraveling its own democracy, because that will have an enormous encouraging effect, I think, on Iran's regime.
Great point, thank you. Yes, and we do have Cameron on the line. So let's all be brief.
Quickly, in relation to what the lady said about the money laundering and all this, whatever happened to the unexplained wealth order? We have something like that in UK, which we haven't used against the Iranian regime, the Islamic regime. If the Iranians who are in the room, I'm sure you have noticed that in the last 2-3 years, there has been an explosion of Iranian restaurants and shops in London and other big cities in the UK. What are they for? When you have a big restaurant which has a running cost of £100,000 a year, and you only see 2 customers sitting in there, what are they doing? It's all for money laundering. It's all for money laundering, and this is what's happening in front of our eyes, and nothing is being done about it.
Great point. Podcast there. I did promise Dory.
It's okay. But I think Charlotte, I would vote for her to be the Prime Minister, honestly. She spoke so beautifully. And I think the only other thing that I wanted to say about what the West could do is that the Iranian people have a lot of money, frozen assets here. And I think that money should be unfrozen and sent to Iran for the Iranian people, because one of the problems of the revolution is lack of funds. People haven't got any money. They cannot go on strike. They can't go to the streets because they've got no money to eat. They've got no money to put in front of their children. The oil workers have to go on strike. The only way of doing that is to send them money. As diaspora, we cannot send money because of the sanctions, because we are not allowed to send money. So therefore, we need to have channels of financial transactions to the people opened up, and this this money which is frozen sent to Iran, so that those are other things that against people who say we can't do anything in the West. Yes, we can. We can definitely allow money to go into Iran so that the workers can go on strike.
Is there a mechanism for doing that without it the money going straight to the regime?
Yes, there are lots of mechanisms, because there's, as Nazanin earlier on said, there is a really wonderful movement of the opposition coming together. I think the Georgetown event showed that how the West, how the opposition from the right, left, center got together and really managed a wonderful show. They have a fantastic network within Iran, and all their message is, let's try and get this money into Iran, into the Iranian pocket of the people, so that they can go on strike, so they can continue being on strike, so this regime can fall. Because without the oil workers going on strike, this regime will still have a lot of might.
Thank you. Cameron Hansarinia, Policy Director at the National Union for Democracy in Iran, thank you so much for joining us. You were involved last year in an effort to, correct me if I'm wrong, sue President Raisi at UNGA, the UN General Assembly. Where did that go? And same sort of question as I posed for Ali in Ottawa. How does it fit into a larger strategy of using levers where you can?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you particularly to Mrs. Ansari for all her efforts, and to Tortoise Media and Kehan for putting on this fantastic event, and pleasure to be alongside all of you in the room and my fellow speakers here from this side of the Atlantic. That's right. Last year, our organization helped facilitate and sponsor a lawsuit against Ebrahim Raisi upon his travels to New York City for participating in UNGA. There have been other similar legal measures against Islamic Republic officials in the past. That lawsuit, however, was launched just at the cusp, in fact, only days after the murder of Mahsa Amini. And so much has changed since then. And so I'd like to take a step back from that particular lawsuit and address this question of what can the West do? Sometimes I feel like when it comes to Iran, we in the West maintain, and I don't mean to offend anyone, but sometimes we still maintain an Orientalist view, as if Iran today is some unknown place, some black box, as if the rules for Western diplomacy, the rules for supporting democratic movements have to be rewritten, as if there's no formula for this. Of course, not everything is a copy-paste formula. But we can always take inspiration from what the West has done, what the United States has done, what the European powers have done to support and promote other democratic movements in the past, and apply them similarly to Iran. we look, on the continent of Europe itself, when in the waning days of the Francoist regime, they were executing political prisoners, and King Juan Carlos was attempting to lead the country to democracy, European countries swiftly recalled their ambassadors. We've seen dozens of executions in the past several years, hundreds of executions, thousands of wanton murders in the streets of Iran. Why have European countries not recalled their ambassadors from Tehran? Are Iranian lives worth any less than Spanish lives were in the waning days of the Franco regime? So these are some of the questions I think that the West has to be asking itself. Of course, the revolution in Iran will succeed because of the people of Iran. They're the ones who are leading it, because they want to, as they say on the streets, reclaim their country. They want this women, life, freedom revolution to succeed. But there are steps that the West can take. There are many things, in addition to a policy of pressure on this regime, a policy of maximum support of the Iranian people, can really help lower the cost for Iranians to transition. So when the question is asked, can the West do anything, or should the West do anything? Frankly, I find it to be insulting to Iranians, because part of asking even that question is almost saying that Iranians don't deserve the same support that the people of Spain did, say, or that the people of South Africa did, or that the people of Eastern Europe in the fight against communism did. So if we believe that Iranian lives are worth the same, and I would posit that that's the case, there's a lot that the West can do to support Iranians in their homegrown revolution for secular democracy.
Cameron, thank you so much. And applause here in London. And thank you for your patience as well. Now, we're pushing the time. We promised you the mic. So, yes, I can see you at the back, but the promise was made to you here at the front. Can we get a microphone here, please? And then I invite you all to talk, to share your points with each other, but I want to come back very briefly to Bronwyn and Matty, and I'm so sorry, but we do have to have some kind of discipline. Go ahead.
So, as far as what the West can do, they can stop being so hypocritical. So we've got public statements from Macron. So we've got public statements from Macron supporting the people of Iran, but at the same time, we have his pictures meeting Prime Minister Raisi, agreeing a deal for ELF, where they're buying oil at $15 a barrel and selling it at $65. So Biden, for example, we've got Jill Biden presenting the Grammy for Barayer, the Song of Peace, which is identifies with this revolution. It's a revolutionary song. And at the same time, actually in the same week, he had sent Rob Malley to Doha to meet with the Qatari foreign minister, who's the go-between with Iran, presumably in an effort to reinstate the JCPOA. And we have heard reports that they are offering Iran $8 billion. They're offering IRGC, which are terrorists, it's a mafia organization, which by their own, they have admitted themselves. They admitted about a month ago that they had then currently detained 21,000 people. 70%, and they also admitted, we know that it's not 21,000, we know it's many multiples of that, but let's just go with 21,000. And of that 21,000, 70% are under the age of 20, the average age is 15, and America is giving them $8 billion. Certainly the West should not be doing that. So I would also go to something that was raised by Miss Roxy Farman, who said that the revolution came about after, I think you said, 15 years of pamphleteering, and it came from the people of Iran themselves. Actually, I would disagree with you. I think that had something to do with it. But recently, the Pentagon has declassified communications between Carter and Kissinger and some of the correspondence with the Shah. And we can see very much how much the West's policy towards Iran was shaped by the price of oil following the 1970s energy crisis in the States. So the West does have a lot to do with it. And in the current climate, when we have a war with Ukraine and cost of living crisis, price of oil, how much of the Western policies are determined by protecting the price of oil? Because most other oil producing countries are currently sanctioned other than Saudi. That's really my question for you,
Thank
Rowan.
you so much. Well, I I do apologise. I think we have to wrap it up now, but I just want to give Bronwyn and Matty, in that order, a chance to address any points that you've heard, but briefly. And finally, this point, there's a lot of optimism in the room that this time it's different. That whatever the West does, in fact, this regime is on its last legs. Do you share that, and why?
I do think this revolution will work in the end because so many people in Iran want it. They're giving so much to it, and they can communicate with each other and with people outside to get that support. But I think we have to recognize the limits on what we can do beyond, as I said, the two things that we're doing that I think have helped support this revolution. And one is the sanctions, which I think have been already destabilizing to this regime, not fatally, but they have helped bring about these conditions, helped bring about the absolute fury of these generations in Iran about what they're being deprived of. Freedom, choices, a chance to make their country thrive. And then we can keep covering it. But I do hesitate at the kind of exhortation from the outside of other people to risk their lives when we're not there, and when it is too easy to ignore the limits on what we can do. And if you look, I just bring you back to Afghanistan, a poor country, a fragile regime we made fun of, in a sense. We, the West, assumed we could get rid of in its back after 20 years with absolutely no rights for women. And that's what we thought we could get rid of. So I just, every time I want to respond to the kind of feeling, you feel in this room, the wish, the deep wish we all have that this is going to sweep away the regime, I do think of Afghanistan.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Matty.
Thank you. I think in the West, in democratic countries, public opinion counts for politicians. It's unlike, it doesn't matter what happens inside of Iran, revolution takes place, but the public opinion is ignored by the regime. It's different here in the West. And therefore, I think the press can play a key role. The reason why I say this, every day we see the coverage of what's happening, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and we are, as we should be, supporting Ukraine, because we know by supporting Ukraine, it's supporting us for our freedom, because if we don't, we knew what the consequences of that is. And so every day we're seeing and we're spending billions of pounds to be able to support Ukraine so that Russia doesn't invade, and the next would be the rest of the European countries. There is no difference with the situation of Iran, and as we can see, the regime is supporting the Russia. So my question is why we're not getting the same coverage, because in terms of the urgency of the matter, it's not just about what's happening inside of Iran, it's about what Iran is, the regime is doing with their activities supporting Russia, and at the same time we're spending billions. So they counter affecting our activity. And this is a key issue that we need to take. And I guess if I would call out for the Western press to really give the public opinion to the politicians so that there can be more awareness on this and more urgency on the fact, instead of just to focus on inside of Iran, because the freedom of Iran, for the people of Iran, ultimately will be the freedom that we will continue to have in the West.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great point on which to end, because it was the reason that we convened this evening, was because the story was not being covered. Am I right? And we wanted to try and contrive a way to get people together who are interested in covering it more and better to talk to each other. So I am hereby decree that 25 minutes after the scheduled time, this discussion is at an end. James.
Thanks for watching that video. There's plenty more over on our channel, so just click here to subscribe.